funded by the British Academy, which Jonathan is running, on policing protests. So basically what we've seen is over the course of the last 5-10 years, there's been a major rise in protests in the three countries that we're comparing here, and a qualitative change and rise quantitatively as well in the way that police forces have responded. So that's how we're looking at it. We've got various initiatives to make that analytically possible. And I think without further ado, we might start off simply by having Jonathan tell us a little bit more about the project, and then each of the other three can tell us what they've been contributing and what the trajectory has been that has gotten them there. So Jonathan, if you would. And yeah, congratulations, thanks, by the way, on being the Pool B champion in the European Curling Championships over the last week or so. So congrats on that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kai. Yeah, so thanks for inviting us today, and also for kind of leading on the project in the Brazil portion of it. So the impetus of this project grows out of some earlier research that I've been doing. So for the last 5-6 years, I've been looking at the political theory of riots and rioting. And I've published a few articles on that, and I'm now working up a book monograph on that topic. And as I got more into studying riots, it occurred to me that really the riot raises a whole set of interesting questions about public assembly, right? So a riot is a violent crowd action, and depending on the legal statute, it normally means, 3 or 12 or more people acting in concert in a way in which the local authorities deem to be a threat to public safety. And as I started kind of studying the history of the riot and riot law, it became quite clear to me that there's always, we really need to reverse the perspective about riots from the actions of rioters to how the state responds to public assembly. Because under most legal kind of codes, what makes a riot is that it's a crowd action that the authorities, usually the police on the site, declare to be unlawful in some way, shape, or form. And when you kind of look at that and realize that there's a lot of power given to local authorities in terms of how they handle crowd actions, we then kind of understand that there's a whole set of kind of interesting legal and moral questions about how police should, how they do and how they should handle public assembly. It also has kind of interesting human rights component. So it's quite foundational in most international human rights treaties that there's a right of what's called public assembly. But in many treaties, there's also kind of a limiting set of language that they kind of said, well, within the scope of reason. And that shouldn't be all that surprising, because if you look at like a lot of democracies, their foundational moments often involve crowd actions, right? So in the big U.S., the Boston Tea Party, or France, the storming of the Bastille. These are, from one perspective, might be riots, but from another perspective, might be kind of direct action by a crowd contesting an unjust regime. And if the regime has the ability and authority to kind of disperse or minimize how people act together in concert, then it kind of is one way of kind of preventing dissent or critique of the government, whether it be in an authoritarian or a democratic regime. And the second thing, as Kai kind of mentioned in his opening comments, is that there's actually been a very significant growth, by some measures about 25 to 30%, in the number of crowd actions, protests, if you will, over the last 20 years. And there's also been a significant spike in those that are at least been deemed violent by the authorities. So that's kind of the context for the project. And really what we're trying to do is look at this interaction between public assembly and policing. And we've kind of divided it up into 3 work packages. So Kai and Susan are kind of leading 2 of the 3 work packages. We also have Daniel on the call, who's our postdoctoral research assistant, who's kind of supporting all 3. And there's a third member, Professor Anna Feigenbaum at the University of Bournemouth, who's leading the 3rd work package. I'll just kind of give a kind of quick overview, and then each of you can kind of talk about what you've learned from your own work packages, or what the specific questions that are motivating you. But really what we wanted to do is 3 things. So the specific call for the grant asks for interdisciplinary international collaboration. And so basically I reached out to people who I thought were doing interesting overlapping work kind of around this area, maybe not directly in some cases, and also kind of working across different sites. And so Brazil's been quite interesting, obviously, kind of given I think kind of basically Kai, obviously, and Daniel can kind of speak more specifically to the context, but at least from my knowledge as an outsider, essentially since the protests against the Rio Olympics up through Bolsonaro, kind of a government period, even kind of afterwards, there's been a significant amount of kind of protests, both against the state, but also against kind of these large mega events. U.S. is also kind of been also very interesting, especially over the last 10 years with the rise of a movement for Black Lives and other kind of mass protest events. And then the U.K. is kind of my home, obviously my home kind of network, but it's also had a lot of interesting kind of uprisings, if you will, over the last 10 to 15 years. On top of that, there's also been a noticeable pattern about the strengthening of anti-riot law and also public and kind of the restricting of public assembly rights. This is particularly the case in the UK, where basically the first kind of major piece of legislation was introduced in past 2 years ago in something called the Police Crimes Courts and Sentencing Act, which put a lot more restrictions on rights of public assembly. And we've had several high-profile cases in the UK over the last few years of people engaging in public protests, that engaging in actions that wouldn't kind of even be normally seen as riots per se, but because of the strengthening of these kind of laws criminalizing protests, they've been kind of clamped down on. Probably kind of most infamously, there's a case of the police preemptively arresting Republicans, as Republicans in the sense of the British sense of those who oppose the monarchy, the idea of the institution of a monarchy, during the coronation of King Charles, and all they did was have a set of signs kind of saying "Not my king." Right, when the police arrested them, detained them for the course of the coronation, only released them afterwards, opting not to charge them. But they were able to do that under the enhanced powers they got from this new bill. We can think of kind of similar case in the U.S. that the conservative political action group ALEC has been passing a lot of laws in state houses across the U.S., often amending existing riot acts to expand or kind of identify other tactics, often those which would kind of fall under the classical techniques of nonviolent direct action, things like affixing yourself to a building, or kind of what we call lock-ons or glue-ons, or kind of blocking or impeding traffic on major roadways. These are kind of classical nonviolent tactics, things that kind of great figures in the past, such as King and Gandhi, would have used in their protest campaigns. But they're being redefined as violent by the state as a way to give the police more powers to stop and prevent actions from happening. And it's interesting that the primary mechanism in both those contexts is kind of expanding the powers of different kind of riot acts or public assembly acts. So we're kind of looking at that. Because we've seen these patterns across all of these three countries, we thought this was a good kind of set of countries to look at. And then we're also kind of being interdisciplinary in the sense that we're drawing on Anna's background in kind of communication studies, my background in political philosophy, and then Susan and Kai's expertise in international relations to look at the human rights component, a lot of the normative issues, as well as looking at kind of the different data sets that have been gathered and publicized around protest. So I'll kind of just briefly bullet point each of the three work packages and let the others kind of talk to what they've been working on. So in terms of the work packages, the first one's led by Kai and kind of the Rio team. And this kind of draws a lot on Kai's work in kind of military policing and kind of civilian military relations. And one of the things we're quite interested in is how there's been an increased development and drawing on military counterinsurgency tactics, if you will, for deployment against publics, both in Brazil, but also in the other two case countries, and looking at how the increased militarization of policing is being used as a way to also increasingly militarize how police protests are being handled. Second work package, being led by Susan Kang at CUNY, is engaging in political ethnography, and she's doing a set of interviews with protesters across the three sites to kind of get a sense of what their experiences are at the hands of the police. So try to get a better understanding of how they interact and how it's affecting their understanding of protest and disobedience. And the third work package, being led by Professor Anna Feigenbaum, is looking at First of all, what we're doing right now is analyzing existing databases on protests and kind of identifying the gaps in those databases. And then we'll be developing a tool in partnership with some human rights NGOs across the 3 countries for activists and protesters in those countries to document how the police interact with them at different protests and different actions of public assembly.
That's okay. Excellent. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Daniel, do you want to tell us about the first work package, then how far we've gotten so far?
Yeah, for sure, Kai. Just a moment. I have prepared a more like structured presentation. Let me just. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Or let me put. Okay. Well. Okay. Thank you, Kai. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon here to talk about policy and protest. I'm not going to talk a lot about the preliminary findings because I have been working all the 3 packages. So I have been doing the interviews in Rio, also now in New York, some of the data sets that we are still planning to do. I have been like auditing those data sets. And I have also been doing some interviews with police officers and some kind of archival research in Rio with military police officers, primarily in Rio. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about the conceptual challenges that I had. The way I see we have some of these problems to talk about this global literature on protests and riots and how police responds to protests and social mobilization in Brazil. So this is more the issue that I'm going to talk now. So the research on policy and protests in Western democracies generally work on a chronology, and here I'm putting like one very simple table presenting this chronology that goes from 3 main periods. The pre-70s, when the police often escalated force to control demonstrations. So at this time, the police would line up in a wall of shields and batons, then charge against the protests, and you would have all these injuries and casualties and so on. And the main examples here are probably the repression against the civil rights movements in the U.S. Then by the 70s and between the 70s and the 90s, the literature often talks about a more negotiated approach. Then in this period, the police favored the less violent approach, avoiding confrontation and investing in established communication channels with the social movements. So the time and location of protests, for example, were negotiated, and even the repertoires of action were discussed between the police commanders and the organizers of protests. But this approach was mainly abandoned after the WTO meetings, the WTO protest in Seattle in 1999, which is known as the Battle of Seattle, was a confrontation of anarchist groups using, not for the first time, but probably on the global stage for the first time, the black box tactics, and the police that had not anticipated the magnitude of protests. They were ill-prepared to secure the venue, so most of the meetings had to be disbanded, so they couldn't have, for instance, the ceremony for the opening of the WTO meeting. And the police simply responded with a lot of violence. So it was a moment of change, both a change and innovation as well, both for the security forces and the social movements. And the negotiation was substituted by multiple strategies aimed at neutralizing the source of potentially disruptive events. So according to this chronology, we are now in this post-Seattle moment, in which the police has these 3 main repressive strategies. One, they use the surveillance and information sharing as a way to assess and monitor risks. They use preemptive arrests and less lethal weapons to selectively disrupt or incapacitate protesters that engage in disruptive tactics, for example, the black box. And they use the extensive control of space in order to isolate and contain disruptive activists, using tactics such as scattering, but also fences, vehicles, and police lines in order to block streets and public squares, also controlling the movement of protests. But how this basic chronology and this typology of repertoires of repression, this list of tactics and so on, how do they translate to Brazilian context? So this is more or less how Kai and I are framing the problem of police repression to social movements in Brazil. So in Brazil, we've got very few studies on this matter. This is the first problem. Most research on police protests and anti-riot strategies has been carried out by police officers aiming at better understanding their old doctrines and practices, or by NGOs such as Article 19, Amnesty International. There is a local NGO, Sou da Paz, which is also very active in this matter. And they generally denounce cases of police violence and police abuse and they list a few suggestions for police reforms. But despite these multiple differences between the research that's been carried out by police officers and the research carried out by NGOs, these two groups share, I would say, a couple of perceptions about the problem of crowd control. The first is that crowd control strategies are very influenced by the army. And the second is that the police imported their models for anti-riot operations from the US and from Germany. And these include like the choice of gear, the choice of weapons, the choice of training, but also tactics, such as Catling, which in Brazil is known as the Caldeirão de Hamburgo or the Hamburg Cauldron. And so this is more or less where the literature now. But despite these close connections between local police forces and those of Western democracies, the chronology that I just presented does not explain the development of anti-riot strategies in Brazil. Most of all, I would say that Brazilian police forces currently deploy the three strategies at once. So depending on the situation, the police use at their own discretion the escalation of force, the negotiation, and the neutralization of protesters. Thus, one could hardly say that we got like one normative strategy institutionalized across the country, or even across Rio de Janeiro, which is the fieldwork that we've been doing more specifically. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about these problems of how we can understand this global literature, how we can picture the local debates now on policy and protests in Rio in relation to these more general issues. So the literature on policy and protests in Brazil has focused on three main issues: the perpetuation of policy models adopted during the military regime, so roughly from 64 to 1985. Then second, the enactment of new laws that criminalize social movements and enhances the scope of police action, and a push for modernization. I mean, I would say like not only investments in training and technologies, but also these managerial reforms, this idea of a new managerial framework that comes from the private companies to the public authorities, with the idea of enhancing police efficiency and so on. So first, in terms of the authoritarian legacy of the police, the literature generally focuses on two main issues. The first one is that riot police in Brazil is militarized, and this is the most obvious issue that we have to deal with. And this means a sort of professional ethos, but also the use of military manuals and gears in crowd control operations. So Rio de Janeiro has a special anti-riot unit, the Batalhão de Choque, which has been trained with the Army's field manual for domestic disturbances. And this is, I would say that this is not an exception in Brazil. There is a police officer from Minas Gerais, Esteban Oliveira, who did a PhD thesis comparing manuals of doctrines development and doctrines developed by the army during the military regimes with the manuals currently used by the police in multiple states. And what he finds, which is interesting for us, is that current techniques, theories, and tactics emulate those developed by the army. Not only the vocabulary is the same, and you can see, like, when you start reading those manuals, you see a lot of charging, columns, shock and awe, and all these really militarized vocabularies, but also the risk that these manuals identify are very similar. So despite the 4 decades that separate us from the military regime, the crowd control strategies in Brazil, they're still designed to face the internal enemies. So the social movements are still seen by the police as sources of trouble, which can cause social disorder and harm the national interests. The second issue that I listed here, and which is also commonly raised by the literature, is what Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro calls the socially implanted authoritarianism. So for Pinheiro, power relations in Brazil has always been characterized by illegality and discretionary decisions and practices by public authorities. So in his words, and here I'm quoting him, authoritarian practices are not affected by institutional change, not even by free elections. The legacy of political transitions in Brazil is the persistency of a high level of illegal violence and conflict. Thus, for many reasons, including the fact that police training doctrines and targets and so on are pretty much the same as they were in the military regime, Pinheiro suggests, and here I'm quoting again, authoritarianism does not end when dictatorships collapse, but it survives transitions and rolls out in new civilian governments, simply because it is independent of political regimes and constitution. So the military regime, during the military regime, the space for social mobilization was obviously reduced. In that period, multiple groups were framed as terrorists, and the police had enormous support, both by the army and the Secret Service, to monitor and repress them. A lot has changed since democratization in the 80s, but the militarized structure of the security forces was maintained by the new constitution, as well as the police culture that identified social mobilization as potential sources of insecurity. The police were never at ease with protesters, and kept some of the tactics and anti-riot equipment from the military regime. In 2013, I would say that it became obvious that we had a problem on how the police deals with social movements and protesters and so on. In general, they have like two modes of action. They would repress with extreme violence or simply step aside and do nothing. And this takes us to the second point. In 2013, not only the police reacted with violence, but also the federal government and the Congress joined efforts to criminalize the social movements. The fear that mass protests might disturb the mega events led politicians from the right and the left to pass a new law against criminal organizations and a law against terrorism. According to this new juridical regime, common practices of protests, such as like causing damage to private and public property, I don't know, like destroying a car or a bank agency and so on, this should no longer be seen or punished as crime against property, but could be framed as acts of terror, which would obviously be punishable with much longer prison sentences. So, and the last issue that I want to talk here, which is also commonly raised by the literature in Brazil, is this push for modernization, which also resulted from the mega events and the 2013 mass protests. We have witnessed in the past 10 years or so a lot of investment, supposedly better training, better tactics, better communication, better equipment, and better technology. The police in 2013 were widely criticized for their incapacity of dealing with the protests. On some occasions, they produced horrendous images of confrontations that enhanced the support of activists. Multiple journalists were beaten or even shot, which led to multiple criticism in the media as well. But on other occasions, as I said, the police were criticized for not managing to contain the protests, thus threatening the mega events. The police response was to seek new anti-riot doctrines and strategies and to invest in new surveillance technology. So Rio's police now have at their disposal operation centers, cameras, those IMSI catchers like the Stingray, which can collect data from mobile phones. They have biometric surveillance. They have multiple monitoring equipment, and so on. So the objective is to build a situation awareness during the protests, so the commanders are able to anticipate the movement of marchers and act to neutralize them. But the police also aimed at stopping activists before they even took the streets. So monitoring communications and social media, the police identified a number of risky individuals and arrested them. Still, the panoply of technology didn't substitute a militarized and violent practice. As Pinheiro argued, their authoritarian legacies coexist in harmony with new technologies and doctrines. And as Dave Ziering, sport editor for The Nation, and he declared after witnessing a particular violent confrontation during the World Cup, I think it was before the World Cup final, and here I quote again, "The high-tech apparatus was used for monitoring and aggressively repressing protests, while the police acted in a manner that connects more with the dark past than with its future." And I move to the next slide. So just to discuss a little bit, very briefly, about the drivers of police violence in Brazil. Charles Tilly, like he's a big name in this field, has a well-known hypothesis in which he claims that police violence impacts the rational choice of protesting. In his words, repression should be defined, and here I quote again, "any action which raises the contender's cost of collective action." That is, the police supposedly balance the responses with the aim of raising the cost for social movements taking the streets. So police violence would be a fundamental variable to understand the repertoires of protesters. But in Brazil and elsewhere, we see a huge difference in police responses. For example, the police act differently in rich neighborhoods and in the favelas. So Tilly's sort of utilitarian framework might be insufficient to understand state reactions. Or at least we need to say a lot more about how the police understand risks and motivation of different social groups and how they adapt their practices accordingly. There are multiple hypotheses that might explain variations in police practices against social mobilization. It is important to stress here, I'm not claiming that one of them is more important than the other. So the explanations most likely a combination between all of them. So first and foremost, different identities of protesters entail different police practices. And in Brazil, we don't need to say a lot about it. Like Black people have 3 times more chances of being killed by the police than white people. If we focus on the Black youth, then the percentage is even higher. In Pernambuco, for instance, for the 2nd year in a row, the police only killed Black people. In Salvador, 94% of the people shot by the police were Black. So that's it. It's kind of the context in which this particular field of practice that we are analyzing, this is the context in which it happens. The second point is that different political actors are submitted to different sorts of repression. So to keep it short, groups with fewer political connections or less access to lawyers and other sorts of legal support are frequently submitted to much more violence. Then the third issue is that different agendas matter. So the literature often states that revolutionary movements, anarchists, communists, and so on, they represent a direct challenge to the political elites and are the ones who are more frequently subjected to police repression. So the same is true for movements that criticize the police or denounce police violence. Not only these protesters are less inclined to negotiate with the police, but also the police tend to overreact while acting against them. The fourth driver is the difference in repertoire. So the police obviously prefer to deal with the social movements that inform public authorities about their events and that even accept to change their planning to include police suggestions. The police also tend to prefer political rallies that are organized in open space and with enough routes of dispersion, as these are easier to control. And they tend to prefer events in which the protests are less prone to carry out illegal practices, such as sit-ins to block the roads or direct confrontation and so on. The fifth element, which I think is the most important here, concerns the different levels of legitimacy attributed by the police. And here I'd say the most important variable, at least in Brazil, is the territory where protests take place. There is a lot of research about how the police reacts with more cordiality when they are deployed to control right-wing protests in comparison to the actions during left-wing protests. In Brazil, we have seen this since 2014. I mean, the streets have been taken by anti-corruption demonstrations, people chanting for the impeachment of Dilma and so on. And while the left-wing, like the counter movements to these right-wing people, when they were in the streets, they were frequently labeled as vandals and so on. They were subjected to a lot of repression. But when right-wing protests were in the streets, they often felt safe near the police officers. They including celebrated, and I put a picture here that like two people dressed in green and yellow taking pictures, security forces. But there's another relevant divide in Brazil, which is not about right-left political interests, but about the asphalt favela divide. The police often see favela demonstrations not as legitimate political actions, nor they see protesters as individuals with which they might disagree, but who have the right to communicate their agendas. When favela movements organize protests, the police often frame these events as criminal actions, or claim that demonstrations are led by the organized crime to demonstrate support or to block the much-needed police operations. Most protesters in Brazil may be subject to police violence once in a while, but favela movements are repressed with extreme violence, including homicidal violence, every single time they organize a public demonstration. So, and I'm here going to the end of my presentation, we should not understand police violence against protesters as detached from police violence in general. Multiple authors have argued that this separation makes no sense in other countries, but this is especially true in Brazil. When it comes to protests in favela, anti-crime operations and anti-riot operations have a lot in common, from the preferred targets to the equipment and the strategies. It is not a coincidence that the Batalhão de Choque, the anti-riot unit that I mentioned, in Rio de Janeiro is deployed to disperse protesters, but also to support deadly police incursions in favelas and for everyday patrolling. So the criminalization of certain protesters engenders a continual practice and narratives that understand some sorts of political disturbance and criminal violence as one and the same. In the favelas, protesters and drug dealers are both enemies of peace, of good citizens, and most of all, enemies of the police. So, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, virtually everywhere, democracy and policing have this uneasy relationship, right? It is evident that, I mean, there is always a tension of protests like taking their grievances to the streets, and the police worried about social order and frequently crashes between them. This is nothing particular to Brazil as well, of course, and not even to democracies or Western democracies, whatever you want to call the Brazilian regime. But police perceptions of threat and legitimacy are not based on objective assessments of protest repertoires and targets. In Brazil and elsewhere, the police work with a large degree of discretion, and this is an essential issue here. So the main challenge for research is going beyond these police documents and discourses about their training, doctrines, and equipment and technologies and so on, and analyzing the different police practices on the ground. This also means going beyond these global policy models, including these basic chronologies and typologies that we see in the literature all the time, to understand how global drivers interact with local practices and histories. I tried here to introduce the main drivers of police violence during protests in Brazil, but there's certainly much more I think we could say in this area. And one just last final suggestion, like one particularly interesting field of study that perhaps you should consider is to complement this state-based coercive repression with private and criminal forms of control. And here, Jennifer Earle, she has been doing very interesting research on what she calls the social control of protest. That's why I decided to call to put the title of my presentation, the social control of protests in Brazil. She's investigating the role of vigilantism and counter-movement violence. And during the interviews that we carried out in Rio, Natasha and I, Natasha Neri, which is research assistant of Susan as well at CUNY's, we carried out a lot of interviews in Rio, and this issue came up several times. The activists, they often mention police repression, but they also express fear of the militias and fear of the far-right groups' violence against them. And this is certainly not like new phenomenon, nothing particular to Brazil as well. And I was looking like in one of these historical examples, and we can see like Henry Ford, he had a notorious group of thugs he hired these thugs to bust union meetings, to curb strikes, threat activists, and so on. But there's still little research about these sort of topics, especially in non-US and non-European contexts. So I think this is also an interesting topic to look at. That's it. Thank you, Kai. Thank you, Jonathan, Susan, and Victor as well. That's it. Let me just stop sharing here.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think, Jonathan, we've chosen our postdoc fairly well based on this presentation. Let's hear from Susan.
Okay, so I don't have a formal presentation, but I agree that we've chosen very well our postdoc. So I am what I would like to ceremoniously call the interview monkey of this esteemed group. So my experience comes both as someone with field research doing qualitative, open, and semi-structured interviews in multiple countries, but also as someone who is a participant observer in the world of protest. So I did not think when we began this project that we would be interviewing activists in the midst of one of the largest global protest moments involving the war in Gaza, but we are. So as a result, we have faced certain challenges in getting scheduling of some of these seasoned activists here in New York City. But it is a good problem because people are thinking a lot about protest in this particular moment, as well as myself as someone who, in all my extra time, I participate in protests. And so my participation in protests, both as someone who has faced arrest and risked arrest many times, has put me in a good position to be well connected to those here in New York City. It's only a city of 8 million, which means that actually it's not that big. And the people who engage in this kind of work all know each other. And so ultimately getting access to these participants is a matter of scheduling rather than finding out who these people are, because I know the people who've gotten arrested for housing, for climate change, for the RNC, for anti-austerity protests, for trade union protests. So I can speak a little bit about that. I can't speak so much to the Brazilian protests because our research assistant is doing the very careful work of doing translation right now of many, many hours of interviews of the subjects that were done in of the interviews that were done in Rio. But I'll just back up a little bit and talk about our methodology, our goals, and sort of our questions. So we are looking at this question from the perspective of political theory around protests. So while our concern is not primarily from the police level and the control level, we are looking at how these things are experienced and understood and justified in the minds of protesters. And so our questions are open-ended, and we kind of start out with a set of questions asking our subjects like, did you come from a family with protests? How did you get involved in the protest movement? And then sort of more conceptual questions about like, why do you choose to protest? What kinds of tactics do you use? How do you make decisions about, for example, engaging in tactics that might risk arrest? And then we move towards really specific questions about interactions with police. And then we start asking them like, do you plan with police? Like, what is a typical interaction with the police at a protest? Explain the most repressive action of violence from protests that you've seen. And then finally, we sort of talk about questions of efficacy, success, and influence of protests. So those are sort of the 4 sets of questions that we ask our subjects. And I can't speak to what Daniel experienced, but I know based on our conversations with Natasha and Daniel that these are very difficult conversations to have with subjects, because the people that we talk to are very seasoned protesters. One of the screening criteria is that they've been involved in at least 10 protests. But for many of these people, they've been involved in 20 odd years of protests, right? And so I would think that protesters who start out, for example, in sort of direct action anti-consumerism protests would stay on that. But actually, the interviews we've done so far in New York show that protesters often protest in a way that reflects the politics at the moment, right? So they may have gotten involved after 9/11 to criticize like the immediacy of the military response in Afghanistan, and then they shifted as ideas changed, right? So initially, one of our subjects, for example, in New York, moved to New York shortly after 9/11 or during 9/11 and became involved in civil liberties types protests. But then over time, was involved in the RNC, was involved in Occupy Wall Street, was involved in anti-austerity, was involved in climate, right? So as, for example, climate organizing has really become really important. This protester, for example, used a powerful bike lock and locked her neck to a bulldozer to stop the building of a fossil fuel pipeline into a community in Manhattan, and as well as her own community in Brooklyn. And then since the primacy of Palestine has taken over protest spaces, a lot of these protesters have said that they've been involved in these protests as well, even if they haven't been involved in a protest since 2014, right? So at least here in New York, we've seen how some of these seasoned protesters respond to the politics of the moment and not necessarily, identify as, oh, I'm a housing activist, or I'm, I'm a trade unionist, but rather that there's this sort of flexibility around protest. And in New York, we've interviewed just 3 people, 2 white women identified and 1 Black man. And it's very interesting how they talk about what they see and they experience. Another sort of quick aside is that our questions had to go through multiple rounds of ethics reviews, and we had to make sure that we wrote our questions in a general enough way that we could get specific information, but not expect anyone to incriminate themselves because of the sensitivity of the information. But at least in my experience so far, and also perhaps Daniel, you can confirm or deny, but I think also in your experience, subjects are willing to speak about their experiences, which are very sensitive and legally complicated, because their stories, I think, are not told or centered very often, right? So the way that media often explains things, they're like, there were these arrests and there was violence, right? But there's not a lot of centering of the individual experiences of protesters. One of the people that we did recently interview was part of a class action lawsuit, which successfully sued the New York Police Department, was it $13 million for their violence against nonviolent protesters in a Black community in the Bronx for their use of kettling and violence. And so listening to the experiences of these protesters is extremely difficult because of the violence that they have had done to their own bodies, as well as the violence that they have witnessed. And there's a lot of it. And it seems that we haven't really discussed this yet. And it's not exactly part of this project, but the increasing violence, at least that the NYPD has shown towards protesters, towards nonviolent protesters, specifically during the Black Lives Matter protests, were so bad and led to such a strong reaction that it's significantly changed the laws around and the legal practices around protests of arrest. So just to give a really clear example, I got arrested in 2021. I had to get sawed out with a circular saw by Special Response Unit. And that was still when old practices existed. And they tried to give me criminal misdemeanor charges, but I had a celebrity lawyer, Ron Kuby, who got me out of the charges because a new district attorney came into Manhattan who dropped all nonviolent charges. But I had a very specific stipulation that I could not get arrested for any reason for 6 months. And now they've gotten rid of that. Now people during these Gaza protests are getting arrested every week, which means that the capacity for people to engage in potentially arrestable offenses has gone up, which is why 1,500 people yesterday on the busiest travel day in America, they just sat down and closed the Manhattan Bridge, which is a major connection point between Brooklyn and Manhattan. And police didn't do anything. They didn't engage or respond with violence, and they didn't arrest them because they didn't have the capacity to arrest 1,500 protesters, right? But they were illegally blocking roads and blocking traffic for this specific political purpose. And I don't want to say that we can generalize that as a result of these changes that we're not going to see like repression, violence, right? Because this was largely, it was a multiracial coalition, but was largely run by Jewish youth, younger activists. So I'd say people under the age of 40, through Jewish Voice for Peace. So certainly racialization of bodies is very important. It's something that the protesters have all talked about. The two white women identified subjects that we've interviewed have said, I have white privilege and I allow myself to get arrested, and knowing that I will be treated differently in the court system, that I have resources, connections to lawyers and other, necessary resources. But they all don't think that, people like, was one of the questions that we were curious whether or not subjects felt that if they got charged, whether or not they fought the charges or they would accept the charges, and they all believe in fighting charges. Whereas the one Black young man said, no, I was raised in an environment, my household, where you do not get arrested. And so that person, this subject, was very careful during Black Lives Matter protests to avoid arrest at all times, and was successful, because that's not always possible, because police are supposed to follow certain procedures, but they don't necessarily follow them because of, all these factors that our protesters were very aware of. Like, if they feel threatened, they'll respond in a way that doesn't follow standard practices. And if they are surprised, then they tend to, respond in a disproportionate manner. And I want to leave a little space in case Daniel wants to talk a little bit about the Brazil interview specifically. And I just want to say that our interviews in New York are like short. They're like 1 hour. People need to get off and go. And they've been over Zoom so far. Whereas in Brazil, many of them were in person. And I think it sort of reflects different cultural practices. They tended to be a little bit longer. And here's the thing, is that all the interviews we do could have gone on for hours, because these subjects have such a rich experience to share. And we'd have to sort of skip questions to get to the most important ones, because many of these, like I said, these activists have been involved in so many different movements. I just wanted to sort of follow on a personal experience, and it's not New York based, but rather DC based, and which is that the police in DC have been very mild in their response to lots of protests recently. There was a big national day for a ceasefire for Palestine, in which police did not respond at all. And, I saw youth kind of climbing up onto police trucks, and nobody did anything, right? So on one hand, there's sort of an acceptance of mass protests and public assembly. But then recently there was a different activity in which Jewish Voice for Peace organized an action in which there was a surprise element. It was at night, and it was in a place that wasn't very public, at the Democratic National Convention. And there were almost no arrests made, but instead the police beat up the protesters, attacked them with bikes, attacked them with bike racks, and broke people's glasses, pepper sprayed them, and then put out a statement saying that they had been violently attacked by protesters. So certainly, even though there have been changes, I thought about this as we've done interviews. The protesters know that the conditions of that particular protest at the DNC were the ideal conditions for police over response, right? Nighttime, it was not in a crowd, it was not in a it was a low traffic area, and they were caught off by surprise, as opposed to, say, the mass protests that would advertised in DC a couple of weeks before. And so that led to this outsized violent response. And one of the things that one of our subjects told us is that police kind of know that as long as there's not clear evidence of property damage and criminal charges, there's not that much that can happen in the legal system. We have attorneys and, who volunteer and get people these 6 months administrative tickets that go away and get erased from people's criminal records. So because they recognize that the arrests aren't that strong of a deterrent, the punishment is in the moment, right? So whether it's indignities upon the arrest, or rough treatment, or just sort of low-level violence that won't necessarily cause permanent injury, but causes pain and harm, that is a practice that they've adopted now as a way to punish protesters for creating this additional labor for them. And of course, anti-police oriented protesters will get the strongest response, the most immediate violent response, as opposed to climate change, anti-austerity, anti-war. But I think anti-war is probably second in line in terms of getting strong responses. And so this is all still very early on. Even though we're early on in the New York, they've been incredible, like engaging in these interviews, and our subjects are, they've experienced so much, and they're very inspiring as political actors.
Great. It sounds like we have a really interesting coverage, actually, of both sides of the equation, both on the police side and on the protester side. And that's one of the things that sets apart this project in terms of what we'll be able to deliver later on to the British Academy. Now we have someone else with us here, Victor, who has been sitting in on at least some of the work that Daniel and I have done, and has a very interesting related project of his own. So tell us a little bit about your work, please.
Thank you, Kai, for organizing the event. Thank you, Jonathan, Susan, Daniel. Well, as Kai already presented me, I work with police as well. I have done interviews with police officers from Rio de Janeiro for my master's thesis, and I tend to work with them on my doctorate as well. And since Kai invited me to speak in this webinar, I began thinking of its name: Policing Protests, Public Assembly Rights and Anti-Riot Technology in the UK, USA, and Brazil. And as I wondered how I could contribute to the discussion, based on my own research, which, as I earlier mentioned, is on policing, its justifications and resources of violence, the discussions about the use of technology in policing sprung to my mind, discussions that became particularly conspicuous in Brazil recently, especially because of the controversy surrounding the use and misuse of body cameras, which I will use as the main example for my argument. And I want then to begin by quoting an excerpt from an interview I conducted with a police officer for Rio de Janeiro's military police. And he says, "There are orders that we don't understand. You go to a demonstration with a political bias. You go there because the political bias is against the government. And you have to go there and do that performance, do that oppression. Just by being there with the equipment, with a non-lethal weapon, you inhibit the demonstration. On the other hand, there's another demonstration with a different political bias that isn't even policed. So we're being maneuvered by the state. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I've already understood that. There are things we will do. There are things we won't do. Oh, that demonstration over there that's going to have a little problem they don't want. Fine. We know they use the police for that. It's very complicated being a policeman in Rio de Janeiro." I bring this complaint because it points to an issue that I believe indispensable to both the discussions of policing and discussions about the use of technology in policing, which is, as Daniel already mentioned, and Susan as well, the police's discretionary powers, particularly when it comes to the exercise of violence. This is important because the police's discretionary powers are the logical conclusion of an inherent and apparently insurmountable tension between the police mandate of holding both law and order. What I mean by this is that despite the commonplace rhetoric that the police is concerned with law and order, law can only be enforced if order is renounced, and order can only be kept if the law is eschewed. For instance, as Egon Bittner points out, and I quote, "In many cases, the criminal process cannot even be set into motion without violent and intuitive action. Before a person can be tried in court, he often has to be arrested. To make arrests, the police need the kind of discretionary freedom that is difficult to reconcile with those observances of civil rights that should be guaranteed in the courtroom. Policemen must apprehend suspects in most instances on the basis of evidence that would not be sufficient in and of itself for a conviction. But far more important than the authorization to abridge the freedom of citizens on the grounds of merely suspected justification is the expectation that the police will use force to achieve their objectives. The authorization and the obligation to use force on the basis of no more than reasonable belief that the undertaken action is justified is the exclusive monopoly of the police. This is a problem that was also pointed out by Brazilian sociologist Julita Lengruber. She says something similar. And in her words, in the moment that the criminal justice system is set in motion, it is in the hand of the police to arrest interpretation of the law. In the last instance, it depends exclusively on the police officer the decision of arresting or not, charging an individual or not, decree a flagrante or not. Furthermore, differently from other actors of the criminal justice system, such as prosecutors, judges, and etc., the police officer makes legal decisions in a context of low visibility, which naturally favors arbitrariness. So, if violence must be banished and legality must be strictly observed, purity can only be maintained if force and intuition are rejected. But if force and intuition are rejected, however, the police can't coerce and impose order. In other words, the necessity for the maintenance of order requires a certain degree of disorder so that the criminal process can be set into motion. In approaching suspects and in demanding their conformity to the rules, rationality must be skewed in favor of intuition, the legal norms must be sufficiently unclear to warrant and enable action, the powers of authority must be virtually limitless, and the rights of defendants must be eventually breached. The lack of clarity surrounding the police authority to use violence and the demand from the state, society, and the police themselves that it must be used, therefore lead to a paradox that is resolved in the form of discretionary power. I bring this to attention because technology is often presented as a corrective to the issues of violence, excess, visibility, and arbitrariness, mentioned by both Wiener and Gruber. Take body cameras, for instance. Those sympathetic to their implementation in policing often remarks that cameras can increase visibility, inhibit excesses and arbitrariness, and therefore reduce police violence. Indeed, recent experiences with body cameras in São Paulo show that they do lead to a reduction in police lethality and police victimization. However, neither body cameras nor any other policing technologies deal with the issue, and here I deliberately don't use the word problem, of police discretion. Technology is instead a primary site of police discretion. To put it in other words, there's no logical and inevitable conclusion to the implementation of technology in policing, no matter how democratic and civil the technology might seem. Keeping with the example, we can think of the role cameras have played in the exercise of violence. If for some, the mere presence of cameras might inhibit violent behavior, including torture, it is not always the case. For instance, in the United States from the second half of the 19th century to the mid-20th century, there were professional photographers specialized in taking pictures of lynchings and of the families and the spectators taking part in it. These pictures were then printed in newspapers and made into postcards. From our recent example, the pictures of torture and prisoner abuse in Abu Ghraib in the early years of the War on Terror were taken by the soldiers and jailers themselves. In the afterwards of David Campbell, the lynching photographs, and the same could be said about torture and abuse pictures, thus display the killers and their victims in the same manner as hunting pictures depict hunters showing off their prey. These technologies instead, and this is my main argument, are only civil and democratic as they are made to be. The same pictures of lynchings that were distributed almost as if they were souvenirs eventually became the primary tools used to dismantle lynching as a socially acceptable public ritual. And the very pictures taken as trophies by the soldiers and jailers in Abu Ghraib later led to criticism of the United States, of the War on Terror, and to the sentencing of dozen soldiers. This is not to say that the War on Terror and racially motivated brutality were stopped on their tracks, which they were not, but that policing technologies and their effects and products are embedded in historical, political, and social context, which they themselves help to produce. Cameras and other technologies can be used to curb police brutality, or they can be used to aid in the identification of targets and in the dispensation of violence, as in the case of drones and surveillance cameras, for example. And just as these technologies are often used to obstruct, hinder, and delegitimize protests and demonstrations for their part are also indispensable tools in keeping these technologies and the police institutions relying on them accountable. Police discretion, which is, as I implied, inexorably linked to policing as a coercive practice, this is manifested in the choice of technologies, when they are used, where they are used, against whom they are used, how they are used. Their effects, consequences, and legacies are open to dispute. It thus becomes imperative that we do make an effort to keep the police and their technologies in check. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's really interesting and actually quite related to what we're doing as well. I think a strong element on both sides to be looked at in terms of technology. Susan, you had mentioned some of the similarities and differences between the interviews that were happening in New York and in Rio, and prompted Daniel to maybe take that up. Do you want to say something about that, Daniel, very quickly?
Yeah. Just a few words. First, I think we should acknowledge the work that Natasha has been doing with us. I mean, we had an incredible list of interviewed people because she has a history of getting in touch with social movements in Rio, so she knows a lot of people here. So, I mean, she was really kind of a gatekeeper for us, and she managed to open the doors. We interviewed very different people in Rio, but most of them were related to police violence. This is very, very common in their narrative. So we talked to some people that were like in the anarchist groups in 2013 and were submitted to like subjected to extreme police violence in 2013. But we also talked to people that deal with a different kind of police violence, and this is the issue that I tried to mention towards the end of my presentation, that they are kind of they're in social doing social mobilization in favelas, and they are talking like, I don't know, access to public policies, like very different issues, very basic issues like basic human rights. And when they go to the streets near the favelas to protest, they are submitted to much more violence than when they try to protest in other places. So I think this is a difference in Rio, and probably a difference also that we may see in New York. We haven't interviewed many people that are kind of outsiders of society talking about their own experiences. The people that we've been talking in New York, they are all like professional activists that are within these global networks of social activists. They have like good lawyers, they have connections to big institutions and so on. But in Rio, when you talk to these people, they always say like police violence is a huge issue, we have to deal with it. When they talk to people that are not connected to the social networks, it's much worse. For instance, when they talk about police violence, we're talking to people that were very, very active in 2013. They were usually saying like, oh, they used the tasers against us. They used like those water cannons. They used the batons to hit us, and it was terrible, and so on. When you talk to these people that are protesting police violence and also like these basic human rights in favelas, they were talking like, okay, the guy was with a rifle in my face, and he threatened to shoot my head in front of everyone. And this is not just a threat, because we have many friends who were killed by the police, and not only like friends connected to the organized crime and so on, but also friends that were just doing their regular stuff. One of the people that we interviewed, she is a very active activist in favela, and she was mentioning that one day 2 police officers got to her apartment. They broke into her apartment. She was like taking a shower. They got her in a towel. They put her in a police vehicle, and they started to go around the favela in the police vehicle, threatening her for hours and hours. Like, this is the kind of torture that police is doing in favelas when we compare like to white people doing protests in Avenida Atlântica, which kind of a rich neighborhood in Brazil. So I would say this is the main difference, not only from Rio to New York, but also between different kind of protests in Rio. I also have some comments to Vitor, but I will leave this later. I think not the time now.
Great. So what I thought we might do is we've already been going for an hour, and that's sort of about as long as we thought we might. So I thought maybe, Jonathan, based on what you've heard here today, did you have thoughts on how this leaves you feeling about how we're doing as a project? And then maybe we'll open up to our big audience of 4 people to see if they have any questions.
I mean, I think fantastic. Like, excellent presentation, Daniel, Susan, like fantastic work already. And Victor, even though you're not on the project, I thought there's a very obvious overlaps between your work and ours. And I thought the discussion of visuality as a kind of mode of police oppression was very interesting in your talk. So I thought it was fantastic. I mean, I think we're making like, if it's self-assessment for like the reports that they put into the BA, I think we're like actually slightly ahead of schedule, which is always nice. I think been very fortunate to have a team that's worked so smoothly. So that's been great. I mean, maybe we could have a little chat, follow up out over email offline about kind of next steps. But I think there's like very good signs with all the presentations today. But yeah, I'd like to hear if there are questions either through, I see we've got like 4 participants here. I'm not sure how many we have on YouTube, but any questions people would have.
There is a Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom window, the Zoom interface, that I think is the one that will allow people to ask questions from the audience. I think that works better than the chat in this case. So let's give it a minute and see if anybody has any questions. And if not, we can we'll sign off already and hopefully get some more as this is posted up on the channel. If you like, vocês podem fazer as perguntas em português também, que eu traduzo depois. Para que não seja esse o problema. Well, it doesn't look like our audience has any questions in that case, unless anybody would like to follow up with a comment. I'd like to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy year-end schedule to participate here, especially after spending the weekend dominating European ice-based competition. And thank you all, and hopefully, we'll be in touch again soon, taking the policing protests project forward. Thank you very much. Wait, we do have a question. No, we have congratulations, but not a question. Congratulations for this great project. No questions. Look forward to seeing it as it moves forward. So congratulations to us, and we will talk soon. Thank everybody for coming, and thanks to those who will see us online.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
organizing
Kai.
this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you, everyone.
Great seeing you all. Are we
Oh,
still
no,
online?
Stop recording.
Oh.
I don't know if we're still online.
We're still on YouTube, it seems.
Oh.
Are we? Yeah, I don't know how to. Oh, here we go.
I think you're the only host, and also there is this BRICS Policy Center person. I don't know who he or she is.
All right, well, then let's just leave. Let's just end the meeting then. All right, well, Danielle, I'll send you a link on
Google Meet.
on WhatsApp so we can
Okay.
talk now. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks for organizing.
guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
See you
Talk to you
now.
soon, Victor.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.